May 3, 2007. Praia da Luz, Portugal. A small holiday resort overlooking the Atlantic. Families were eating dinner. Children were sleeping. And somewhere inside an apartment at the Ocean Club, a 3-year-old girl was asleep in a room with her 2 younger siblings. Her name was Madeleine McCann. Just before 10 p.m., her mother opened the bedroom door. Madeleine was gone. The window was open. And from that moment, an ordinary family holiday became one of the most famous missing child investigations in modern history. But almost 20 years later, one question still hangs over the case. What happened during the few minutes between Madeleine being left in that apartment and the moment her disappearance was discovered? Because there was no confirmed eyewitness to the abduction, no body was found. And despite searches across Portugal, Britain and Germany, investigators have never publicly established exactly how Madeleine disappeared. Today, we are going back through the evidence. Not the internet theories. Not the rumors. The evidence. And at the center of the modern investigation is a German man who lived near Praia da Luz in 2007. His name is Christian Brückner. German authorities consider him their main suspect. But there is a crucial distinction. He has never been charged with Madeleine's disappearance. And he has always denied involvement. So how did investigators get from a missing 3-year-old in 2007 to a suspect identified 13 years later? And what, exactly, do they believe happened? Madeleine Beth McCann was born in Leicester, England, on May 12, 2003. She was nearly 4 years old when she disappeared. Portuguese police records described her as approximately 90 centimeters tall, with light brown to blonde hair and distinctive eyes. She was on holiday in Praia da Luz with her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, and her younger twin siblings. The family was staying at the Ocean Club Resort. For the McCanns, the holiday was supposed to be ordinary. Sun, swimming, dinner with friends, and childcare provided through the resort. During the day, Madeleine and the other children attended activities at the Ocean Club. On the evening of May 3, the adults planned to eat together at the resort's tapas restaurant. The children would remain in the apartments. That decision would become one of the most scrutinized elements of the entire investigation. But to understand what happened, we need to understand the layout. Apartment 5A was on the ground floor. Madeleine and her siblings were sleeping inside. Her parents and their friends were eating at the nearby tapas restaurant. The distance was short enough that the adults could walk between the restaurant and apartments. And they said they intended to check on the children periodically. The question would later become, who checked when, and what did they see? May 3 began normally. Madeleine spent part of the day at the resort's children's facilities. Witness statements recorded by investigators place her at the Ocean Club during the day. Later, the family prepared for the evening. There was nothing publicly known at the time to suggest that this night would be different. But investigators would eventually reconstruct the final hours before the disappearance minute by minute. According to the police file timeline, the group had a regular dinner booking at the tapas restaurant. Around 8:30 p.m., members of the group began arriving. Jerry and Kate McCann were among them. The adults were together. The children were in their apartments. And the evening appeared routine. But then came a sequence of checks. According to statements from members of the group, adults periodically returned to the apartments. The purpose was simple. Make sure the children were asleep. Make sure everything was okay. Then return to dinner. There was no CCTV system recording the apartment entrance. No camera captured Madeleine leaving. No eyewitness definitively identified an abductor. And that absence of direct evidence would become one of the defining problems of the investigation. At approximately 9 p.m., the evening was still continuing. Then came the moment that changed everything. Kate McCann went to check on the children. She later said she discovered that Madeleine was missing. The precise sequence of events and timings became the subject of extensive investigation because witness accounts did not always align perfectly. But one fact is undisputed. By around 10 p.m., the alarm had been raised. Madeleine was missing. The immediate assumption was that she might have been abducted. People began searching the resort. Doors were checked. Streets were searched. The surrounding area was examined. People called out her name. The Portuguese authorities were contacted, and within hours, the disappearance had become an emergency. But the first hours of a missing child investigation are critical. Every minute matters. Every footprint matters. Every object potentially matters. And this is where the investigation would later face criticism. The search expanded through Praia da Luz. Residents and holidaymakers joined police. Roads were checked. Open areas were searched. The possibility that Madeleine had wandered away was considered. So was abduction. As the hours passed, the search became increasingly desperate. Her photograph began circulating. The world was introduced to the face of a missing British child. The photograph would eventually become one of the most recognizable missing person images in the world. But behind the photograph was a much more complicated investigation. The initial Portuguese investigation became enormous. The British government and police would eventually become heavily involved. And as investigators tried to determine what had happened, suspicion began moving in several directions. One of the earliest people publicly identified as a suspect was Robert Murat, a British Portuguese resident of Praia da Luz. Murat denied involvement. He was eventually cleared. But he would not be the last person placed under suspicion. As investigators struggled to establish what had happened, attention turned toward the people closest to Madeleine. In September 2007, Kate and Gerry McCann were formally made arguidos, official suspects under Portuguese law. The development transformed the investigation. For months, international media attention intensified. Theories spread rapidly. Some focused on the possibility that Madeleine had been accidentally killed. Others suggested an abduction. Others accused the parents. But suspicion is not proof. And in July 2008, Portuguese prosecutors archived the case because investigators had not obtained sufficient evidence establishing that the suspects have committed a crime. Kate and Gerry McCann were cleared of suspicion. Robert Murat was also cleared. No one was charged with Madeleine's disappearance. The case had reached something close to a dead end. But it wasn't over. Because thousands of pages of investigative material remained. And years later, another police force would look at them differently. In 2011, the British Metropolitan Police began an investigative review of the case at the request of the British government. The operation became known as Operation Grange. Initially, officers reviewed the previous investigations. Then, in July 2013, the Metropolitan Police changed the status of its work. It became an investigation. British officers began working alongside Portuguese authorities to pursue specific lines of inquiry. The operation remains active. The Met says it continues to work with Portuguese and German authorities. And this was important because the investigation was no longer limited to the assumptions made in 2007. Old evidence could be reconsidered. Old witnesses could be interviewed again. And old phone records could be examined using newer technology. Then, almost 13 years after Madeleine vanished, investigators made their most significant public move. June 2020. German authorities publicly identified a German man as a suspect in Madeleine's disappearance. His name, Christian Brückner. Brückner had lived in Portugal for years. And crucially, he had lived in the Algarve region. He was not a random stranger who appeared on investigators' radar decades later. He had been in the geographical area around the time Madeleine disappeared. German prosecutors announced that they believed Madeleine was dead. But there was an important problem. They did not have a body. And they had not publicly revealed evidence sufficient to charge Brückner with her murder. Brückner denied involvement. Still, investigators began reconstructing his movements. And one piece of evidence became especially important. Telecommunications data. On the evening Madeleine disappeared, a mobile phone associated with Brückner was active in the Praia da Luz area. Investigators have said telecommunications evidence placed him in the area. This matters. But it needs to be understood correctly. A mobile phone connecting to a cell tower does not automatically prove where a person physically stood. It can help establish an approximate area. It does not, by itself, prove that someone entered an apartment. It does not prove that someone abducted a child. And it certainly does not establish murder. For investigators, however, the phone data was one piece of a much larger picture. There was another element. Brückner had a criminal history. He had been convicted of serious offenses, including the rape of a 72-year-old woman in Portugal in 2005. He had also previously been convicted of child sexual offenses unrelated to Madeleine. Those facts explain why investigators regarded him as a significant suspect. But again, a person's criminal history does not prove that they committed a different crime. The question was whether evidence connected Brückner specifically to Madeleine. And that question remains at the heart of the investigation. Investigators also examined vehicles associated with Brückner. One detail attracted particular attention. A vehicle linked to him changed registration shortly after Madeleine disappeared. This became part of the investigative picture. But it is important not to overstate what this means. A change in vehicle registration is not proof of an abduction. Investigators must determine why the change occurred. What vehicle was involved, who had access to it, and whether there is independent evidence connecting it to Madeleine. The case therefore became a puzzle made of fragments. Phone data, vehicles, witnesses, Brückner's criminal history, his connections in Portugal, and statements attributed to people who knew him. One of those witnesses would become particularly controversial. A former associate of Brückner, Helga Busking, later told investigators that Brückner had made a disturbing remark about Madeleine. Busking said that after Madeleine disappeared, he and Brückner discussed the case. According to Busking's account, Brückner made a statement suggesting knowledge of what happened to the child. Busking eventually became an important witness for German investigators. But there is a crucial complication. Witness testimony is evidence. It is not automatically fact. Investigators must evaluate when the statement was made, whether it was independently corroborated, the witness's reliability, and whether the account changed over time. That distinction became particularly important because Busking had a criminal history and his testimony was challenged in other proceedings. So the question is not simply, did he say it? The question is, can investigators prove that the statement was genuine, reliable, and connected to Madeleine's disappearance? When German authorities announced Brückner as a suspect in 2020, prosecutor Hans Christian Walters said investigators had evidence leading them to believe Madeleine was dead. But the evidence was not fully disclosed publicly. That created a strange situation. Authorities appeared convinced. The public wanted answers. Yet prosecutors could not simply reveal every piece of evidence without potentially damaging the investigation. Brückner continued to deny involvement, and investigators continued searching. In 2022, Portuguese authorities formally named Brückner as a suspect. The case had now become an international investigation involving Britain, Portugal, and Germany. Then came another question. If investigators believed Madeleine was dead, where was she? In 2023, investigators searched areas around the Barrage Unanswered reservoir. The location had previously attracted attention because of its connection to Brückner and his movements in Portugal. No definitive public breakthrough emerged from the search. Then, in 2025, German and Portuguese authorities conducted another major search. This time, investigators focused on areas around Atalaia, including abandoned structures and other locations. Search teams examined land, wells and reservoirs. The operation covered a substantial area. Again, no immediate discovery solved the case. For investigators, the absence of a body remains one of the central difficulties. Without a body, there is no confirmed cause of death. Without a body, there is no direct forensic examination of the victim. And without that evidence, prosecutors face an extraordinarily difficult burden. But absence of a body does not automatically mean a murder cannot be prosecuted. It simply makes the evidential challenge more complicated. In 2024, Brückner appeared before a German court. But this was not a trial for Madeleine McCann. That distinction is essential. He was being tried for unrelated sexual offenses. The court ultimately acquitted him of those charges. The decision did not clear him in the Madeleine investigation because he was never on trial for Madeleine's disappearance. He remained a suspect in that case. At the same time, he continued serving a separate prison sentence for the 2005 rape conviction. This created another important moment. Because eventually, Brückner would leave prison. And when he did, investigators would have to continue the Madeleine investigation without him being incarcerated on an unrelated conviction. In September 2025, Brückner was released after completing his sentence for the unrelated rape conviction. But he was not charged over Madeleine's disappearance. That distinction cannot be repeated enough. He remained a suspect. Not a convicted murderer. Not a convicted kidnapper. A suspect. German prosecutors had previously acknowledged that they did not have enough evidence to charge him in the Madeleine case. And the investigation continued. Then, in 2026, reports emerged that British investigators were intensifying their efforts. In May 2026, British media reported that Metropolitan Police investigators were seeking to determine whether enough evidence existed to bring Brückner to trial in the United Kingdom. The reported objective was extraordinary. A potential prosecution for the abduction and murder of Madeleine. But reports of investigators seeking a prosecution are not the same thing as prosecutors authorizing charges. As of this documentary's publication, Brückner has not been charged with Madeleine's disappearance. He remains a suspect. The Metropolitan Police itself says Operation Grange continues to pursue viable lines of inquiry while working with German and Portuguese authorities. Then, in June 2026, reports emerged that German authorities had transferred further material to British investigators. Some reports describe this as a significant evidence dossier. However, the public does not have access to every underlying item. And not every reported claim has been independently confirmed by investigators. That distinction matters. In a case this famous, information can spread faster than evidence can be verified. Let's separate what is known from what is suspected. We know Madeleine disappeared from apartment 5A on May 3, 2007. We know she was 3 years old. We know her parents were dining nearby. We know an immediate search was launched. We know the original Portuguese investigation examined numerous possibilities. We know Kate and Gerry McCann were made official suspects in 2007. We know they were cleared when the Portuguese investigation was archived in 2008. We know Operation Grange began reviewing the case in 2011 and became an investigation in 2013. We know German authorities identified Christian Brückner as a suspect in 2020. We know Portuguese authorities formally identified him as a suspect in 2022. We know he has denied involvement. We know searches have continued. And we know Madeleine has never been found. Now consider what we do not know. We do not know publicly, with courtroom-level proof, exactly how Madeleine left apartment 5A. We do not know where she was taken. We do not know where her remains are. We do not know whether Brückner was responsible. And we do not have a judicial verdict determining what happened. For the McCann family, the investigation has lasted almost 2 decades. They endured intense public scrutiny. They were once suspects. They were cleared. And they continued searching for their daughter. Their position has remained that Madeleine was abducted. But a documentary must distinguish between a family's belief and an established fact. The investigation has never publicly established the complete sequence of events. That is precisely why the case continues. For Kate and Gerry, every anniversary represents another year without an answer. For investigators, it represents another year in which evidence may still exist somewhere. And for the public, it represents one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern era. The answer may lie partly in the first hours. The investigation began under extreme pressure. Thousands of people were in the area. Information came from multiple witnesses. Media attention exploded.
He remains a suspect. The Metropolitan Police itself says Operation Grange continues to pursue viable lines of inquiry while working with German and Portuguese authorities. Then, in June 2026, reports emerged that German authorities had transferred further material to British investigators. Some reports describe this as a significant evidence dossier. However, the public does not have access to every underlying item. And not every reported claim has been independently confirmed by investigators. That distinction matters. In a case this famous, information can spread faster than evidence can be verified. Let's separate what is known from what is suspected. We know Madeleine disappeared from apartment 5A on May 3, 2007. We know she was 3 years old. We know her parents were dining nearby. We know an immediate search was launched. We know the original Portuguese investigation examined numerous possibilities. We know Kate and Gerry McCann were made official suspects in 2007. We know they were cleared when the Portuguese investigation was archived in 2008. We know Operation Grange began reviewing the case in 2011 and became an investigation in 2013. We know German authorities identified Christian Brückner as a suspect in 2020. We know Portuguese authorities formally identified him as a suspect in 2022. We know he has denied involvement. We know searches have continued. And we know Madeleine has never been found. Now consider what we do not know. We do not know publicly, with courtroom-level proof, exactly how Madeleine left apartment 5A. We do not know where she was taken. We do not know where her remains are. We do not know whether Brückner was responsible. And we do not have a judicial verdict determining what happened. For the McCann family, the investigation has lasted almost 2 decades. They endured intense public scrutiny. They were once suspects. They were cleared. And they continued searching for their daughter. Their position has remained that Madeleine was abducted. But a documentary must distinguish between a family's belief and an established fact. The investigation has never publicly established the complete sequence of events. That is precisely why the case continues. For Kate and Jerry, every anniversary represents another year without an answer. For investigators, it represents another year in which evidence may still exist somewhere. And for the public, it represents one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern era. The answer may lie partly in the first hours. The investigation began under extreme pressure. Thousands of people were in the area. Information came from multiple witnesses. Media attention exploded. Different investigative agencies became involved. And the evidence had to survive years of scrutiny. As time passes, memories change. Physical evidence deteriorates. Witnesses move. Technology changes. And suspects may disappear across borders. Yet there is another reason. The case contains no single piece of publicly available evidence that conclusively answers everything. Instead, investigators have a collection of fragments. A phone signal. A suspect's history. Witness statements. Vehicle information. Geographical connections. Search locations. And other material that authorities have not fully disclosed. The challenge is transforming fragments into proof. Christian Brückner was in Portugal. He lived near Praia da Luz. He had a criminal history. His phone was active in the area. Investigators believe other evidence connects him to the case. But the critical question remains. Can those pieces be assembled into evidence proving beyond reasonable doubt that he abducted and killed Madeleine? That is a question only a court can ultimately answer. Until then, every statement about his guilt must remain qualified. This is not merely a matter of language. It is the difference between an investigation and a conviction. There is no final verdict in Madeleine McCann's disappearance. There has never been a trial establishing who abducted her. Christian Brückner has never been convicted, or even charged, in connection with her disappearance. Madeleine has never been found. And therefore, the central mystery remains unresolved. German authorities have treated her as presumed dead. British investigators continue to investigate. Portuguese authorities remain involved. And her family continues to search for answers. The investigation has crossed borders, governments and generations. But after all these years, the most important fact is also the simplest. A little girl disappeared. And her family still does not know where she is. There are cases that become famous because of the crime. And then there are cases that become famous because the answer never arrives. Madeleine McCann's disappearance is both. It is a story about an ordinary family holiday that became a global investigation. A story about police mistakes, international cooperation, forensic science, media pressure and the limits of evidence. But beneath all of that is a child. Madeleine was not a headline. She was not a mystery. She was a daughter. A sister. A little girl who was supposed to wake up the next morning and continue her holiday. Instead, her photograph traveled around the world. And almost 20 years later, investigators are still asking the same question. Where is Madeleine McCann? Perhaps one day, a piece of evidence will answer it. A witness. A recovered object. A forensic discovery. A confession. Or information that investigators have not yet found. Until then, the case remains open. And the search continues.